All right. And back to operating procedures. We're going to talk a little bit about HF now. Making an HF contact. First, you want to listen. And this is a point of contention with a lot of people. If sit down at your station, turn on the radio, grab your mic, and put up a call, you're going too fast because somebody might be already using that frequency. Now, keep in mind that just because you don't hear anything in the first 15 seconds doesn't mean nobody's talking on it, because one of the parties could be out of your range and another party in your range. So give it a couple minutes, listen a little bit, and then you want to ask if the frequency is in use. And I generally ask at least twice. If I'm not certain, then I ask a third time. And I give it about 30 seconds in between asking each time. Is this frequency, is K4XLG, is this frequency in use? And then wait 30 seconds and repeat the same thing. After the second time, if I'm relatively certain that nothing's going on, I'll go ahead and make a call. Sometimes I'll do it the third time. And then what I say is nothing heard, CQ, CQ, CQ. This is K4 or Kilo 4 on HF. You do want to use phonetics because there's a lot of things that come into play that affect the quality of the received audio on the other end. So the NATO phonetic is what you should. NATO phonetic is what you most people expect you to use. I'll put it that way. Okay, but other people have their own phonetics. And some of them make sense, but the thing is, the NATO phonetic is intended and designed from its very beginning to the words that you use to represent the letters couldn't, unlikely that it would be mistaken for another word or another letter. Okay, so and that's what puts it, that's why it all is the way it is. So you call CQ, 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 CQ. This is Kilo 4, X-Ray Lima Golf calling CQ. And a lot of times you can say, if you're on the 20-meter band, say calling CQ on 20 meters. I'm not sure why people put the band on there, but I've started doing it just because I hear so many people doing it. And some people get upset. And then sometimes, I don't know. I don't like to make people upset. Replying to an HF contact, the send calling station's call sign followed by your call sign. So the same way, I'd hear this is in the middle much more often on HF than I do on VHF or UHF. So this is W3, Whiskey 3, Romeo Delta Lima. This is Whiskey Alpha 4, Echo Charlie Tango. So transmission, if you want to make a and that's how you put up the CQ call, and then that's how you answer the CQ call. Test transmission. Sometimes people just want to press the push to talk and test their equipment to see if they're getting out and see what's going on their meters on their radio. So whenever you do that, you do want to identify. Anytime you press that push to talk button, you need to identify who's doing it. So always identify with your call sign. What is the meaning of the procedural signal CQ? Delta, calling any station. If you call CQ, you're calling any station. If you're calling someone specific, you would call, call out their call sign first and your call sign second, right? And back in my CB days, there would be some other stuff to go along with that, but we don't say in the ham world, do you have your ears on? Okay.
What is that thing over?
Okay. What should you do before calling on this on HF? Remember, what should you do before calling CQ? Delta. All these choices are correct. Listen first to be sure no one else is using the frequency. Ask if the frequency is in use and make sure you are authorized to use that frequency. And that is, I don't know, did anybody download the frequency chart from ARRL? Okay, so you'll notice that on there it's broken down by your record, your license class. Okay, so and that's your incentive, one of your incentives to move on up into a license class. That's how I got to extra, because every time I got on the radio, I would look at this signal coming in and then look at my chart and say, oh man, just outside of my reach. So I better go get that general license. So I went and got the general license, and then I sat down at the radio and listened in and found that signal and looked at the radio chart. And, oh man, I need an extra now. So that's how I ended up at extra. Always check that chart or memorize it, one or the other. It's not that tough to have it within reach when you're in your radio room. But yeah, always check that chart to make sure that you're within your license range. Most people will politely point out that you're in the wrong place for your license. Other people are not so polite. So how should you respond to a station calling CQ? So you're on your HF radios, you hear a station calling CQ, and you want to answer up to them. How do you do it? Charlie, transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. Which of the following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions? Alpha, identify your station, the transmitting station, always, and making sure that you're in the right range. Operating procedures, HFQ signals. Now, on CV radio, you have the 10 codes. In ham, you have the Q signals. Now, I want to point out that the Q signals, this discussion came up in a forum that I was on the other day. The person wanted to know why they haven't been updated to be more logical. Okay. They weren't created to be logical. The Q signals were created to that would really be messed up. Yeah, the Q signals were created to be easy to send by Morse code. Okay, so you're not going to see a lot of letters in here that have a lot of characters or a lot of dits and das. I'd have to actually look through it to see, but these are the common ones that you're going to use. QRM means receiving noise. That means noise on your end, or noise coming over the radio. QSY means you're going to change frequency. QRS means send slower. Okay, there we go, send slower. It doesn't mean talk slower. That means you're sending Morse, and you're sending it too fast for the person on the other end to read it. So they're asking you QRS, send slower. QSL means confirmed, and a lot of these are still used because you hear QSL when you're on single sideband all the time. QSL, let's see, QTH is location, and there's a dispute about that. Some people say QTH is your home of record, which is where your license is assigned to. Other people say QTH is where you're transmitting from. Not 1020. See, she knows them. So QTH is location. QRL is frequency is busy. So if you start talking on there and someone says, hey, this frequency is QRL, but these things were made to send by Morse code. They're not necessarily to be used for voice communications, but they are still used. Okay, which Q signal indicates that you are receiving interference from other stations? QRM, receiving interference. Okay. So receiving interference from other stations. And sometimes, depending on your radio, you might be able to adjust filters to move one side or move the width of the filter one way or the other to get out of the range of the ones that are interfering. Something you just have to play with a little bit. Which Q signal indicates that you are changing frequency? We're going to QSY to, you're talking on 145. Well, let's say you're talking on 14.325. Say let's QSY to 14.315. This helps when you have a second receiver on your, if you have a second frequency option on your on your transceiver, you can move to that frequency to make sure that it's open and you don't have to. Your band scope, sometimes you will be able to see that on there. So it'll help you get to a usable frequency quicker. Operating procedures, HF operation band plan. FCC provides general operating procedures. Band plans provide detailed information beyond the FCC privileges. So, when you look at this chart, let's see if I can find it here. So when you look at this chart, and you look on there, let's say, we're going to look, since you guys are going to be 10 meter people, when you look on here for 10 meters, you'll see that, let's see, novice and technician have 28.3 to 28.5 for that. That's where you guys are will be allowed to talk on the 10 meter band. So that is not, that part is issued by the FCC. They're saying that's where you're allowed to talk. But now when other people go down there and start talking, they're not violating the procedures. They're still authorized to talk on there. I done lost my train of thought now. Let's see, band plans provide detailed information beyond FCC privileges. Yeah. So what I was going to say there probably doesn't apply to you guys. But you've got areas here that are CW only. Okay, that's not an FCC rule. That's a band plan that somebody set up. And because we're gentlemen and ladies, we observe it. And then sometimes you get somebody on there that's not a gentleman or a lady, and they don't want to observe it. So, but the FCC just sets the limits of the bands and what you can do with your license. But beyond that, the way it's subdivided, all that is done by the ARRL, by convention, I'm sure. Band plans provide detailed information beyond the FCC privileges. Voluntary guidelines for different operating modes and activities. In other words, some places there's set up for, set aside by ARRL for weak signal. So you're doing a weak signal mode and you're in that area and somebody else is trying to talk on single sideband there. It's probably, it's not an FCC violation. You can't report them to the FCC for that, is what I was getting at. Shows subbands reserved for different modes. What is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? Alpha, a voluntary guideline for using different modes or activities within an amateur band. Okay, a basic tenet of amateur radio is courteous operation, and part of courteous operation means that you're not going to flame anybody out. When stations operate on the same frequency, they should negotiate between the two of them continued use of the frequency. One has to agree to move, the other one says, okay, then I'll stay here then. Sometimes there's a little heat over that, and this comes up a lot of times with nets, because you've got nets that have been operating for 40 years. And then now with the growth of the POTA activity, which is Parks on the Air, a POTA operator who got his license 3 days ago wants to go activate this park and doesn't understand what parts of the bands are being used for other things, and then they want to get uptight about it. And that's the places where you normally see that. So, nets, I will usually defer to a net if I'm on there, because I don't know all the nets. I don't know what time they start, but if one starts up and I'm on there, then I just move. Sometimes it's hard to find another frequency, though. Which of the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other? And before we answer that, I'm going to bring up one other thing that can cause this too. Band conditions change throughout the day. So you could be going on one frequency, and then all of a sudden the band starts shifting a little bit, and you're interfering with somebody else, and that's nobody's fault. But somebody needs to move, and somebody gets to stay. So which of the following applies when two stations transmitting on the same frequency interfere with each other? Alpha, stations should negotiate continued use of the frequency. Public service and emergency communications. Amateur radio is an integral part of emergency communications. We have ARES, ARES, Amateur Radio Emergency Service, which is a group of licensed amateurs, and these are on the test, so you have to remember the difference between them. A group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment in public service. And then you have RACES, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, which is an FCC Part 97 radio service for civil defense communications during national emergencies. Service using amateur radio operators, stations, and frequencies, and that's the big thing is frequencies. I'll talk more about that in a second. For emergency and civil defense communications. An emergency service using amateur operators certified by a civil defense organization as being enrolled in that organization. The frequencies, this came up during Helene when she was south of us and starting to head north. Some people decided that they didn't want to recognize the 14235 or I can't remember, but there's on 2 meters or 20 meters, there is a specific frequency that's reserved for hurricane nets when there is a hurricane inbound. And some people didn't want to acknowledge that, and they just kept going on them. So if a situation like that comes up, it's usually better to go ahead and change your frequency than to cause static there. The Amateur Radio Emergency Services, or ARES, was established in 1935 as part of the ARRL field organization. ARES consists of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in the public service when disaster strikes. And these guys are working hard right now up in the mountains up there, up in East Tennessee and North and South Carolina. In fact, that's where David is right now. Anybody that doesn't know, David's up there helping out. But he's supposed to be back next week. Amateur radio and emergency communications. If we look closely at the Federal Communications Commission regulations that govern amateur radio, we find that there is no mention of having fun or seeing who can talk the furthest. However, there is a very specific mention of amateur radio providing a trained pool of radio operators available in times of need. In other words, our ability to communicate when normal communication infrastructure is overloaded blown down or unable to function for any other reason, we are able to get a license, and that's the basis for it. So when you're out activating a POTA park, or when you're at your house hunting POTA, or you're just trying to do, that's what got me started in that, or I won't say that's what got me started, but that was my first interest when I got into when I got my HF, my license to run on HF, my general, was I was always looking for POTA stations to rack up on. Since then, I've kind of shifted my focus to DX because, you know, you get a lot of contacts here in the US and Canada and Puerto Rico from here pretty easily, but to get the contacts in Europe or anywhere else outside the country is a tougher thing to do. But recognition and enhancement of the value of the amateur service to the public as a voluntary, non-commercial communication service, particularly with respect to providing emergency communications. That's 97.1 alpha. But yeah, so when you're out there doing your POTA stuff and everything, you're not just having fun, you're training for an emergency. Okay. What is the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, ARES, ARES? Alpha, a group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications during communications duty in the public service. What is the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Services, RACES? I'm going to go, you think it's Delta? Look at that. Yep. Good one, Michelle. Okay, what is RACES? Delta again, an FCC Part 97 amateur radio service for civil defense communications during national emergencies. Communications network set up for emergencies. Net control stations organizes the network. Oh, let's see, communications network set up for emergencies. Okay, so that is what nets are typically for. Okay, and when you have your weekly net to log into and everything, that's practice in testing your station to make sure that everything is ready so that when it is needed, it's ready to go. Net control station, NCS, organizes the network. The net controller calls the net to order and directs communications. Some nets are a little more relaxed, but you should always defer to the net control. Net control handles check-ins and controls the communications. Which of the following are typical duties? I'm going to say one more thing about this. Has anybody listened to the net on 137, 145.37? Okay. So the first thing, and Steve is prompt. I mean, exactly at 7:15 when the net is supposed to start, he starts it. And he's got a preamble that he goes through to tell what it's for and how we're going to do it and everything. And to say, please use some form of the phonetic alphabet. Okay. But he gets on there, calls, and then he starts off with, they go by suffixes, not prefixes, because prefixes would be a long line for 2 or 3 different, but by using suffixes, he can say A through, I think it's A through F or something like that, Alpha through Foxtrot. So for me, my suffix is XLG. So I'm waiting until the very last one And then I have to wait because Byron is on there like a split second after Steve says it. So I let Byron check in first and then I check in. Or I start looking for a spot to check in. So, which of the following are typical duties of the net control station? Okay, so let's go back here a second. Calls the net to order and directs communications, handles check-ins. Okay, so we've got choose the regular net meeting time and frequency. No, that's not it. Ensures that all stations checking into the net are properly licensed for operation on the net frequency. Call the net to order and direct communications. Ding, 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 ding. Okay. I fell for this too myself. I remember specifically saying, yeah, that's the one. They ensure all the stations checking in to the net, and then I stopped right there. I didn't read the last part, but he doesn't go through and check to make sure that you're licensed. So, calls the net to order and directs communications between stations checking in. So what he will usually do is he'll say, when you check in, let me know if you have traffic. A lot of nets just, you check in, and if you have no traffic, you just say no traffic. But on this particular net, he just wants you to let him know that you have traffic. And then we move on. And then after everybody gets checked in, he'll say, we'll check again before we adjourn for late check-ins. And then he'll go to, Byron's almost always got some sort of traffic to put out. This week it was about the QRP, because today was QRP day. And he'll say, after everybody gets checked in, and say, Byron, what was your traffic? And Byron says, hey, I want to remind everybody that Saturday is QRP day, 9 o'clock to 1, and it'll be at Stratham Park. So, all right. Which of the following is a standard practice when you participate in a net? Charlie? Unless you are reporting an emergency, transmit only when directed by the net control station. So you've checked in, and unless he asks you something specifically, there's no need to transmit any further unless you have to go out. It's customary check out if you leave the net before the net is done. Okay. Emergency communications net. Traffic on an emergency communications net is messages passed between stations. Way back in the day, they would send message traffic wherever they needed it to go through amateur radio stations. Handling of traffic is passing messages. Good traffic handling, passing messages exactly as received. So if you got the operator's manual or operator's book, I can't remember which they call it, but it's a ARRL book. In the back, there's some copies of forms, and when you look back there, there's one of them, I believe, that is for passing traffic. So you can make a note of the message being sent that you're receiving, and then you can read it off word for word to the next step of the transfer. Use of standard phonetic alphabet is recommended because, like they say, good traffic handling is exactly as received. So if you have to say letters or something, you be sure to use the phonetic alphabet. And there is your phonetic alphabet. It took me about 10 minutes to learn that when I was 18 years old, and fresh wet behind the ears sailor. And for some reason or another, I've remembered it all these years. What does the term traffic refer to in net operation? Messages passed by net stations. That is correct. Which of the following is a characteristic of good traffic handling? Alpha, again, passing messages exactly as received. What technique is used to ensure that voice messages containing unusual words are received correctly? Spell the words using the standard phonetic alphabet. You guys are on top of it. Okay, public service. Let's see. Formal traffic message, 4 parts. You have the preamble, which is tracking information. Check. Let's see. Okay, so they're saying there should be a check there, which would be the number of words equivalent, words or word equivalents in text. The address will be the name and address of the recipient. The text would be the message content, and the signature would be your address. Well, no, sender's address, I'm sorry. Okay, what information is contained in the preamble of a formal traffic message? Preamble is tracking information. Okay. Well, let's see what it says. Information needed to track. So yeah, right there it says in the preamble tracking information, but I was thinking the address of the recipient too. Oh, okay. So that's got its own 4 parts: preamble, address, text, and signature. So I knew I'd seen that somewhere. All right. So information needed to track the message. So I would guess that would be each station that passes the message onto another station would be recorded in that. What is meant by check in a radiogram header? Alpha, number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. Okay, and that is in the text portion of the message. So that is the message that you're passing, not all the other 3 sections. The number of words or word equivalents in the text portion of the message. FCC rules always apply. Always apply. Okay, so remember I had sent a message out and told everybody that we're going to have the class, and I told you that use your best judgment, if because I don't know your area. So if you can't get there, then by all means don't. I also pointed out, I gave you the repeater frequency, the repeater uplink frequency, and the code, the PL tone, and told you that you can't talk on the radio, but in the interest of saving human life, any form of communication that you can establish is acceptable, and nobody's going to complain to you about that. Same applies to protection of property. Now, I don't know what you could do to protect anybody's property during a hurricane, but if you need to get help to save someone's life, those are the exceptions: saving human life or protection of property. When do FCC rules not apply to the operation of an amateur station? Delta. FCC rules always apply. Are amateur station control operators ever permitted to operate outside the frequency privileges of their license? Delta, yes, but only in situations involving immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Takeaways: making an HF contact, CQ means you're calling any station. Before you call CQ, you should listen first, ask if the frequency is in use, and make sure you're authorized for that frequency. Responding to a CQ, transmit the other station's call sign first, followed by yours. On-air testing, be sure you identify. Some people will complain about you testing, but nobody can really say anything if you've identified. So always identify. HF operation Q signals, QRM means receiving interference from another station. QSY means moving to another frequency. So if you're receiving, if you're talking to someone and you say, I've got some QRM, less QSY. Everybody says, oh man, those guys are so smart. They know all those things. HF operation for the band plan is remember that the band plan is a voluntary guideline for using different modes or activities within an amateur band where, obviously you couldn't operate a low power digital mode or a weak signal mode while somebody's trying to blast 800 watts, right? So that's what the band plan is for, to keep certain things in certain areas of the band so that we can all coexist in harmony. HF operation, frequency use, two stations using the same frequency should negotiate continued use of the frequency, right? One's going to say, well, you know what, you can stay here. I'll go ahead and swing up, 5 kilohertz, 6 kilohertz, something like that, to get out of the way. Public services and emergency communications. We've got ARES, which is a group of licensed amateurs who have voluntarily registered their qualifications and equipment for communications duty in the public service. And RACES, the Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, radio service using amateur frequencies for emergency management or civil defense communications, a radio service using amateur stations for emergency management or civil defense communications. Let's see. Stations, okay. An emergency service using amateur operators. So you're using frequencies, stations, and operators for civil defense, okay, as being enrolled in that organization. And remember that the big key for RACES is that it's part of Part 97. Okay, nets and net control. Net control stations calls the net to order and directs communications. Unless you are reporting an emergency, transmit only when directed by the net control station. Traffic is the passing of messages. Good traffic handling is messages passed exactly as received. And we did a test on this last year. Phonetic alphabet is used to ensure messages are received correctly. Formal traffic message. Preamble is information needed to track the message. The check is the number of word or words equivalents in the text portion. FCC rules operating an amateur station. FCC rules always apply. Operating outside of privileges, yes, but only in situations involving immediate safety of human life or protection of property. Any questions?